What's up, YouTube? Back from my short trip to Las Vegas. I had a ton of fun hanging out with the DGAF community. Big thanks to Brad Owen, who not only let me stay at his place, but hung out with me the entire time that I was there. Originally, my plan was to document some hands from the games that we were playing over there at the Sahara. Unfortunately, what I ended up doing was playing a bunch of different crazy games, such as pot limit deuce to 7 triple draw, Big O, 5-card pot limit Omaha, and some other wonky things that I just wasn't able to document. And I don't really even remember exactly any of the fun hands that I did play. Thankfully, we did book a win to help pay for our trip. Instead, to continue with our one chip challenge, where if I don't put out enough videos till the end of the month, I'll be having to eat this spicy chip. We're going to instead jump into a recent session that I played at Lucky Chances Casino of Pot Limit Omaha. So let's get into that now. It's been a while since we've done this late night poker grind. Got word that there was a game of PLO running. Don't think they've been getting much of that. And considering that we've been vaccinated and took a little bit of a nap putting Charlie to bed earlier, figured, you know what? Why not head to the casino at midnight and see what's going on? So good luck to us, and let's get back to that 4-card grind. Alright, so as soon as we arrived to the casino, I don't even have a chance yet to pull out my phone. So that's right, this actually isn't the exact hand, but I know how much you degenerates love seeing live action. It's a similar hand. I end up getting dealt ace, jack 4 with the jack 4 of hearts. There is a limp to my right. I decide to limp. It's not a particularly great hand. Obviously, we want to retain some aces post-flop in spots that we're not expected to have them. The small blind now makes it $50. The limper to my right calls. I decide to pot at this point. Obviously, we're only playing $1,000 deep, so I figure if we can get most of the money in pre-flop, then that's going to be the best situation for us. The small blind then calls, and the player to my right who limped now folds. We ends up going heads up to a flop, which comes 8-5-5. He checks, and I decide to check back. Obviously, this is a board that's not particularly great for my range, and if he decides to check raise, probably just going to have to go with it. The turn is now a 3, and he leads for 200. I go into the tank. I want to kind of sell the fact that I don't have a great hand, and that I will not be particularly calling a river, because obviously I plan on kind of calling off a lot of rivers here. Once I call, the river ends up coming a 9, completing the 6-7 straight draw. He bets 200 once again. Obviously, with this sizing, I don't really love it, but getting such great odds, I'm not going to be folding. So I call, and he ends up tabling, I think, like 10-10, 6 deuce. Just some absolute trash as an overpair. I'm not really sure what he's doing on the river. I assume it's some sort of blocker bet for value. But anyway, we end up scooping up this pot, and we're off to a nice start. So we're playing 2-3-5 pot limit Omaha, although there have been some occasional dark raises under the gun to $10 and $20. In this hand, there is a $10 dark raise. Under the gun limps for 10. I limp ace deuce 9-8 with nut spades. There is another limp in late position, and now the big blind decides to raise to $40. The limper calls. I decide to call with my hand, obviously looking to make the nuts with the 9-8, or potentially the nut flush as well. The late limper calls as well, and we go 4 ways to a flop, which comes jack 10-4 with 2 spades, flopping me the open ender and nut flush draw. The original raiser pre-flop now decides to check, as does the player to my right. So now I'm faced with a decision as to whether I want to be betting my strong draw or checking, potentially giving the last act the initiative. After some thought, I decide to bet. Obviously, given the fact that the 2 players to my right have now checked, I don't expect either of them to be particularly strong. For example, if the pre-flop opener had a hand such as maybe ace, king, queen, I would expect him to bet this flop unless it's a hand that doesn't contain any spades. Similarly, if he himself had some more spade draws, perhaps like king, queen, X with the king high flush draw, I would expect him to bet. So I don't think that we're going to be seeing that either of these 2 players has like 2 pair plus. So by betting, it's very likely that I'm going to be able to take control of the hand. Obviously, we do always have the option to hit our draw. I decided to bet 110. Now the last act player decides to fold, and we end up getting 2 calls from the 2 players to my right. I think when we get 2 calls from them, I expect that their hands are going to look like some straight draws, perhaps something like king, king, queen, ace, king, queen, ace, ace, queen, ace, ace, king. Just the hands that are going to have the upper end of the straight draws. Also, another reason that I decided to bet this flop was to potentially get folds from a hand like ace, ace, king. If the turn ends up being a queen, obviously now we're going to have the bottom end of the straight, and I wanted to try to elicit some folds from some of these nut gut shots. Obviously, now that they've called, I think that they do both possibly retain some of these ace, ace, king or ace, king, king type hands. We end up going heads 3 ways to a turn, which is now the offsuit 10. They both check to me once again. Now, this is where I think that I made the biggest mistake in the hand. Obviously, this turn to 10 is now a terrible card for my hand, as I could be drawing dead. That said, as I said on the flop, I didn't think that either of these players had a particularly strong range. That being, I didn't think either of them had flop top 2 or a set, as I would expect either of the two players to be betting those hands. So this card is actually a much better card for my range than it is theirs. I think that their most likely hands are still going to be worse flush draws as well as straight draws. And so really the best play here is to be betting small, something like 1/3 pot, to try to get folds from either of those types of hands. Obviously, if one of them does decide to continue, then I think we could likely shut it down on the river, as they were very unlikely to be continuing with hands unless, it's a hand something like ace, ace, king, 10, or some other hands that contain a 10, which now have the opportunity to make a full house. Anyway, I ended up deciding to check back, as it is kind of a scare card for my hand, which I think is probably the biggest mistake that I did make. The river now peels an offsuit 9, and we're left with just a pair of 9s. They both check to me once again. I think this is a situation where it is extremely likely that one of these players obviously has made a straight at this point, whether it's king, queen, or the lower end of the straight draw. It's a situation where obviously we could just end up blasting pot, trying to get them to fold these hands. Our hand is going to look a lot like a turned full house that wanted to let some of the draws get in there and try to get value on the river. The only real issue here is that I had previously seen both of these exact players play a really strange hand where they ended up getting to showdown with some particularly weak holdings. So I'm not really sure that this play is going to work. Like I said, I think betting the turn is a much better play to try to get folds from the straights. Trying to get folds on the river where it's just one bet just usually is a losing play. I decide now to check back, as I expect that they won't be folding any of their value hands. The opener shows the bottom end of the straight, and the player to my right now has the top end of the straight with king, queen. Actually, looking at their hands, I remember seeing that it wasn't particularly good, and so it kind of gave me an idea that going forward, they were going to be playing pretty loose and splashy. My biggest regret in the hand was not betting the turn, and I think if I wasn't so rusty, it's a play I would have made. The next interesting hand of note, we're playing 3-handed. I'm on the button with king, king, 9, 8. The big blind opens to 20, and I elect to flat in position. Obviously, this is a spot I could be 3-betting, but I want to keep ranges wide. The flop comes ace 9x with 2 clubs. He checks, and I check it back. Now, the turn comes a club, bringing a possible flush. Having the king of clubs, I do block the nuts. He now elects to bet to $20. Obviously, this is a spot where I don't expect to ever have the best hand, and upon further thought, I elect that I'm going to be taking my king of clubs nut blocker and trying to bluff him off the pot. After some thought, I make it $85. Now, when he bets this turn, I expect him to have 2 pairs, some possible small flushes, as well as a complete air that just don't think that I'm going to be continuing on this board. So when I raise the turn, I don't think I'm going to immediately be getting folds, but I do expect that if he does call, that he should be folding to some big bombs on the river. Looking back on it, given who this exact opponent was, I don't really love this thought process. Also, I think on the turn, I should probably be raising a little bit smaller, as if I did in fact have a high flush, if not the exact nuts, I'd probably raise it to like 3.5x, and not to something more like a full pot size raised. Now, as we can see in the video, he pretty much snap calls me. In fact, his chips are in the pot before I'm able to put my own money into the pot. I think this is generally indicative of a fairly strong hand, but one that does not want you to continue blasting. Obviously, given that I'm blocking the nuts, if the river's a brick, my intention is to keep blasting. The river peels off a complete brick. He now snap checks, and obviously sticking with the plan, I'm going to be betting large. The pot is $210, and after some thought, I decide that I'm going to be betting $200. As you can hear in the audio of the video, he then lets us know that he flopped top set, showing his pocket aces, which I guess he was trying to trap with on the flop. At this point, I'm actually feeling a lot better about my bluff, because as soon as I bet the 200, I'm thinking to myself, this guy is just incapable of folding a flush. He starts going into the tank, and the more and more he's thinking about it, I'm like, oh my god, I can't believe this guy isn't going to even fold a set here. Looking back on it, I think my biggest mistake is my large sizing on the river. He is now able to deduce that I either have the nuts or nothing, and he starts to analyze whether I would play a king-high flush in this way. I actually had to edit down the video because of how long he was taking. It eventually got to the point where I thought he was leaning towards a call, and so I decided I would try to talk to him, maybe persuade him into folding.
You have a set of aces?
Yeah.
Oh, it's a really big hand.
Having now re-listened to the audio, I think it's actually possible that he said that he had a flush as well, which would make sense as to why we checked the flop. After some thought, he eventually makes the call.
You win.
I never ended up looking at his two side cards, obviously because I knew that he had aces. I couldn't beat that either. Looking back at the hand, I think I really butchered this one on multiple levels. On the turn, when I block the nuts, I think raising is fine, but I can go to a smaller sizing, something more like 60, 65, which is exactly what I would be doing with the nuts. Then once he snap calls, we could probably figure out that his range looks something like two pairs, sets, and some middling to low flushes. So my sizing on the river really only needs to be something like 2/3 or 3/4, which is what I would be doing with the nuts, trying to get value. If he's not going to be folding to 2/3 or 3/4 sizings on the river with his value hands, then obviously he won't be folding those to a pot-sized bet either. Oftentimes in pot limit Omaha, it can be easy to look down at your hand and be like, oh, I blocked the nuts, people only raise the nuts, and so this is an obvious play to make. But really, what you need to take into consideration is your opponents. Obviously, I'd seen him play some hands previously that I did mention where he just wasn't capable of making any folds. And so trying to make him fold what I perceived as value is obviously a really big mistake on my own part. Now, all of that being said, I don't want to take away from his excellent call on the river. As we heard in the audio, he was able to deduce that my sizing looked a lot like I either have the nuts or nothing. And so I think when he put down how the exact hand played, from beginning to end, he just figured out that I had was way too many bluffs in my range, so kudos to him. The remainder of the session was marked mostly by me just running really terrible. There were two particular hands where I flopped the nuts, ended up betting pot on the flop and the turn, only to have the river bring in the most obvious draws. In one of them, he checked to me, I checked it back and lost. And in another one, he ended up potting the river for 800 when the straight and flush got in there. If he was bluffing, congratulations to him. It was just a spot where I was not able to call with top set. And unfortunately, that was just about when the game broke at 6 in the morning, so we ended up losing $1,500. I think I was pretty happy with the way I played overall. Obviously, if I ran a little bit better, then things could have went my way. Just that's how the cards break. Anyway, that's all for the interesting hands for this session. Thanks for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed this view from the table, and we'll see you in the next video.
I'm a living legend, even when I die, I'm a live forever. I'm one word with 10 letters, successful. One word with 10 letters, successful.